everyone. I'm Ellen Snowinbus. I'm the chairman of the One Book, One Community Bridgewater area group. But as much as I'm a chairman, this is a collective group of very active people that represent a lot of Bridgewater people, West Bridgewater, East Bridgewater. I'm from Halifax, so it's nice. I was just saying to Nancy, it's nice to do things in collaboration. Because when you collaborate, the work gets done in a more relaxed, easygoing fashion. So we've had a fantastic fall. We went up to Boston on a bus trip. The books we read have been fascinating. We've really focused on, with the Sue Monk Kidd book, Invention of Wings, the personal experience of slavery in Charleston, South Carolina, and then the Charles Sumner book, which was really all about Boston and DC. And just as an aside, yesterday I had the privilege of going to Mount Auburn Cemetery and finding Charles Sumner's grave. Yay. So that was a big check mark off my bucket list. It was really fun. And there's so many luminaries who are buried there. That's incredible. So what I'm going to do is going to give you a little preview of what to expect next, because we've got a lot still to go. And then I'm going to turn it over to Gloria to introduce our wonderful guest speakers tonight. Tomorrow night, don't think we're done. Our big event in East Bridgewater is happening at 6 p.m. Stephen Puleo, who has, we've followed Stephen Puleo through his entire career, back from the molasses black tie, all the way through all of his other fascinating books. I think this Charles Sumner book is just a stellar piece of writing. It's the great abolitionist, Charles Sumner, and the fight for a more perfect union. And if you have never heard Stephen Puleo speak, he just speaks extemporaneously about history, how he wrote the book, why he wrote the book, because he's already written another book about Charles Sumner called The Caning. Because if you recall, Charles Sumner was caned, beaten on the floor of the Senate, almost to death by a Southern secessionist. And so this is the same. He went back to Charles Sumner and wrote his entire story, which was just fascinating. He's coming to East Bridgewater tomorrow night, 6 o'clock at the East Bridgewater Library. It's going to be really jam-packed, so you want to get there early to get a good seat. I'm pretty sure if you have a copy of his book, you can get it signed. I think his publicist, is coming with copies if you would like to buy a copy there too. And then later in November, on Tuesday, November 26th, where the Bridgewater Senior Center is hosting a book discussion about the book, but we're having Willie Wilson, who is a local historian of Black history in this area, come and join the discussion. So that is going to be, you're really going to want to pick his brain. And at one of our meetings, we just said, what about this area? What was going on in the Bridgewater area during this tumultuous period right before the Civil War? And what was the demographics like? How were people living their lives? And Gloria said that she knows people in the history department in Bridgewater State who can tell us all about it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gloria, who's going to introduce our speakers for tonight.
Thank you. Jaimie Huff is an associate professor of criminal justice at Bridgewater State University, an affiliate faculty with the African American Studies program. Her research and teaching interests are in law, with a focus on American legal history and the legal experience of marginalized social groups. She and Dr. Field have spent the last several years collaborating on a project to uncover more about Bridgewater's colonial era Black and Indigenous communities, enslaved and free. Dr. Emily Field is an associate professor of English and African Studies at BSU, where she founded the Afro-American Studies program in 2018. She holds a BA from Columbia University and a PhD from Boston University. Dr. Field teaches courses in American and African American literature, as well as African American studies. She has published articles in multiple journals, including most recently, Phyllis Wheatley, White Victimhood and Black Belonging, the Age of the 1776 Report in Early American Literature. She lives in her home city of Cambridge with her husband, their son, and a mischievous parrot. Welcome, Jaimie.
And we can take those two stands, I suppose. Yeah. All right. Cool. So I wanted to begin. Oh, sorry, I wanted to begin. Am I a little better there? All right.
That's great.
I wanted to start by thanking Gloria for introducing us and thanking One Book, One Community for hosting us tonight. And I'd like to thank the Bridgewater Public Library for hosting us as well. I want to start with a few acknowledgements, and I'll also give an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. But I like to start by talking about our intentions and also acknowledging that we try to approach this work with a spirit of humility, and that begins with an acknowledgement that we live and operate on Indigenous land. I'd like to acknowledge both the Massachusetts and Wampanoag people who have been the caretakers of this land for millennia, who are still here, and whose stories are not often told. We also like to acknowledge that we are often presenting on Indigenous and tonight primarily African American history, and yet we are white people. How we relate to this history, all of us together, is shaped by our own social locations and our own experiences. We may make mistakes, and we ask for grace and extend that to others as well. We also acknowledge that we are not local scholars. While we both work at BSU and we have strong ties to this community, I grew up in South Carolina. That's where I lived for most of my early life, and Emily is from Cambridge, as she mentioned in her bio. But what we're presenting tonight is actually Bridgewater's history. It's your history. So what we tell you and how it changes your sense of place, if you're from here or if you live here, it is up to you, and it may mean something different to you based on who you are and where you live in this community. I'd also like to talk about our intentions briefly with our research. We always intend to honor and respect the people we study. We try our best to find out what we can, as near to true as possible, without adding too much subjective interpretation. We think this truth is necessary for the present because we can't really progress without accurate knowledge, and that knowledge, in the case of much of this, has in many instances been willfully hidden from us. So we also have an interpretation of making the town and the world more comfortable and less hostile, especially to folks it has been hostile to. We'd like it to be a more welcoming space for everyone. And we think that having a good sense of our own history can help with that process. And finally, the point here is not to make anyone uncomfortable, but you might learn things tonight that do make you uncomfortable. If you are Black, it can be hard to hear, as people say, that people who look like you were enslaved. If you're a white person from Bridgewater, it can be hard to hear familiar names you may associate with good things associated with enslaving people instead. So we ask that everybody come to the presentation with that in mind as well. Tonight, we will also talk a little bit about the origins of our project. We will talk about slavery in Massachusetts and in Bridgewater more specifically, and we will really delve into the stories of two enslaved men in Bridgewater who free themselves through their own effort. We'll also talk about what emancipation looked like in Bridgewater, what the lives of those folks looked like after slavery, and we'll give you a works cited as well. That part's less exciting. I can do the next slide. So this project began in 2018. At the time, I was looking through some records at First Cemetery, right around the block from us right now. I was preparing for a class. I will not talk about why I was doing that to prepare for a class on law. That is a longer story than I have to tell tonight. But as I was looking through those records, I noticed a name that really stuck out to me, and that name was Cuff Ashford. I recognized that this name had a West African origin to it, that it indicated the ancestry of a person buried over in the corner of First Cemetery. And that intrigued me. I started to do some more research, and I found that actually there were multiple people of African ancestry buried in First Cemetery. Most of them are buried right where that red circle is. They are off right at the margin of the cemetery. A colleague put me in touch with Dr. Field, and we began what has become a very fruitful relationship, combing through archival documents, vital records, and so on, to try to learn more about the town's early African American population. Over time, we have created a database with the names and related records of over 400, African American and indigenous people who we know lived in Bridgewater from about the early 1700s up through the early 1800s.
And we have a week over you.
All right. So we're going to tell you the stories of two of these people in particular, one of whom is buried in the corner of the cemetery. And the location of these burials is not a mistake. People of color were buried in the margins of the cemetery.
Can you point to where the church is in relationship to the cemetery?
Oh, sure. So this is the front, this is Summer Street, and the church is this way. It's
Over
here.
there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's Summer Street.
Mhm.
Got
Yeah,
it.
just to orient you, that's Summer Street.
And,
And this is School Street over here.
and you'd be going toward the center as you would go from left to right?
Yes.
Or from right to
That's
left, rather?
Or toward the center is, so CBS is over here.
Okay, got it.
So we're gonna go in deeper and tell you the stories of two people in particular, but first I wanted to talk about slavery in Massachusetts in general. If you were born and raised in Massachusetts, how many of you were born and raised in Massachusetts? And how many of you grew up hearing about slavery in Massachusetts? Was that part of your education? Not mine either, and I went to a very lefty hippie school named after Rosa Parks. And even so, I still did not grow up learning about slavery in Massachusetts. We were much more readily taught about how Massachusetts was part of ending slavery. And we were here, I know that you're learning about the work of the great abolitionist Charles Sumner, but before that, there was slavery in Massachusetts for 150 years. The first record of slavery in New England is a ship named Desire that took enslaved Native Americans from Salem to the West Indies. So enslaved Native people were shipped to the West Indies and returned with enslaved quote unquote Negroes, etc. in 1638, just 18 years after the Mayflower. Historian Wendy Warren calls the relationship between colonization and slavery, quote, a deadly symbiosis. One could not have thrived without the other. According to her, by her best estimates, by 1700, there were 90,000 English settlers in New England, 1,500 enslaved Africans, and 1,500 Native Americans living here. Sorry. All right, do you want to show the next slide? So, sorry, I'm having a little bit of the shakes tonight, not my usual way. So these are two wonderful books about how the story of Massachusetts slavery gets written out of history so that none of us kind of learned this history in school. One, Disowning Slavery by Joanne Pope Mellish, and the other, Making Slavery History by Margot Minardi. And they both kind of tell how this gets written out of our story of ourselves after the Revolutionary War. They're both really terrific books. Okay, so, all right. Okay, so to bring these broader realities of slavery in Massachusetts home to Bridgewater, we're going to tell stories of two people. But I did want to talk a little bit about some numbers. There was a slave census in Massachusetts in 1754, which recorded about 2,700 enslaved people in all of the state. We know that's an undercount. There were many more enslaved people. Bridgewater didn't take part in that census, so that led some people in town to brag that there were no slaves in Bridgewater. So in the bicentennial of celebration of 1856, for example, when the celebration of the founding of the town, there was somebody, Nathaniel Washburn, bragged, oh, there hadn't been a slave in Bridgewater at that time because they didn't take part in the slave census. But in the 1771 tax valuation, which is a giant red book, it's very heavy, and it didn't start out as a book. These were handwritten records. 21 individual Bridgewater residents reported that they owned people. So this is self-reporting. We know people like to cheat on their taxes. So some people owned people who did not report that they owned anybody. But you can see the column there of servants for life. And this was the kind of euphemism that people used for slavery at the time. So the word slave does not appear hardly in the vital records that Jaimie was talking about before, that we use to make our database. But you can see listed next to the other forms of, how many tan houses do you own? Superficial feet of wharf. Most people in Bridgewater don't have any wharf. And you can see some of the numbers there. servants for life. So 21 Bridgewater residents reported in 1771 that they owned 26 people at that time. We know this is an undercount again, but at least it's a very concrete record. Here are 21 men reporting that they own 26 people. No names in this record, but in our own record keeping, we've found at least 62 people who are referred to with language that's clearly about, that shows that they're enslaved. And the next slide will show some of that language. So this is from the vital records in town. Yeah, you can show the highlighting if you want. And you'll see that same language of Negroes, et cetera, is being used in 1916 when these records were compiled into one book. So the town kept records, mostly in the churches, in the 18th century, and then they were all gathered together in the early 20th century in 1916, and you get that same sort of dismissive language that was used in the Desire ship in 1638. You can see the language of ownership and possession. Mr. Hugh Orr's servant man, Colonel Holman's Negroes, servant man to Colonel Edward Howard, Negro servant man to Colonel Josiah Edson. So these are all people who were enslaved. The servant, you learn quickly in these records, servant means an enslaved person. It doesn't just mean somebody who's serving in the house and being paid, etc. All right, so that is one of the ways that we learned to recognize enslaved people. As I said, we have this sort of language referred to. 62 of the people of the 400 in our database are referred to in this sort of way. Many more were likely enslaved, but we try to err on the side of only, citing what we actually have evidence for. We've seen databases in which, it's all of the people of color are referred to as enslaved, and we don't like to do that because we know that some people were free. As you see there, Beulah, free Negro woman. And so we wouldn't want to sort of lump her in and do that damage to her history. We're going to move now from the general to the specific. And Jamie's going to talk in particular about a person named Toby Talbot who lived here in town. And then I'll come back to talk about somebody else.
Sure. All right. Get my next slide up then. Toby Talbot is indeed one of my favorite people to talk about in Bridgewater. So I do this all the time. I do it to students. I can't help it. Talbot makes his first definitive appearance in the historical record, in the record that you are seeing right here. This is a vital marriage record dated February 3rd, 1755. Of course, this is a copy. Talbot's name is spelled a bit differently here than what his family will settle on later. We see it spelled probably 30 to 40 different ways on the record, little minor changes to it, but this is indeed the same Toby Talbot that we'll trace throughout this presentation. You'll see here that he's listed as enslaved to the widow Lydia Keith. Lydia Keith was married to Ichabod Keith. We know from some additional records that, as best we can tell, Toby Talbot was initially enslaved to Robert Howard of Bridgewater as a child. Ichabod Keith purchased him at some point in his young life, and whenever Ichabod Keith died, Toby became claimed as the property of the widow Lydia Keith. Lydia actually marries about 2 more times after this, so the different people who will claim ownership over Toby Talbot in the town's history will change quite a bit. You'll see that Toby's wife, Dinah Gould, here is enslaved to Deacon Ephraim Phobes. Now, Toby Talbot and Dinah Gould actually had a relationship before that marriage, a pretty well-established one. They have their first daughter, Sarah, in 1754. But they likely chose that February 3rd, 1755 date for a very specific reason. And the reason is right here. It's a bit blurry, but this is about as good of a shot I can get of this will. This is the will of Ephraim Phobes, and it was being presented in probate court on February 3rd, 1755. And if you notice the language of the will, here Dinah is being willed away to another family. Ephraim Phobes is reaching the end of his life, and he's willing Dinah away to his daughter Maryfield and her husband Jabez. She's willed away right alongside a quarter part of a sawmill and some other household materials. This would have meant that Dinah Gould is being moved quite far away from Toby Talbot, but these two are married to one another. So you can imagine here that Talbot and Dinah decide to get married on this day as a strategic move. This marriage would have solidified their relationship. It would have made it recognizable and legible to members of the broader community. And we actually see this quite frequently in the literature on African Americans in colonial Massachusetts. Public officials, ministers did officiate weddings for Black people, including enslaved people, well through both the 17th and 18th centuries. And Bridgewater is really no exception here in recognizing those marriages. We know that often people who were enslaved strategically used those marriages to try to carve out space, to protect their family relationships, and to try to keep their household intact in some way. Now, it is quite likely that Toby Talbot and Dinah Gould didn't live in the same household for the entirety of their marriage, and this was very common in marriages among enslaved people at this time. They were still forced to live separately as members of white households. But we have pretty good reason to believe that these two did manage to live together for the bulk of their marriage. Part of that is that between 1754 and 1780, Toby Talbot and Dinah Gould have 11 children. All of them, as best we can tell, at least most of them, seem to survive into adulthood. And you are seeing the record of all of those 11 children here. They're not chronological. I don't know why the ordering is that way, but the dates are off to the side. One thing we should note as well is that these two made a point of registering every birth of these children with the town. This is amazing. We have other records that show us that not every enslaved person in Bridgewater is listed in the vital records, but Toby Talbot and Dinah Talbot make a point of having each of the births of these children recorded. This brings to mind what the scholar Caritha Mitchells calls homemade citizenship, the ways in which African Americans kind of strategically navigated their communities to make a sense of place for themselves, even when society was trying to keep them from doing that. And this type of registration would have also further solidified and recognized their family. It would have been a way for Toby and Dinah to mark out that they are a married family, that they are supposed to be an intact household, whether the social and legal norms of the time wish them to be separated into white households. This gives them the way to say, no, we're a household unto ourselves. These are the children that we've had together, and we are asking the town to recognize the births of each of them. I'll leave you go, yeah. As we will see throughout this presentation and really throughout the historical record, Toby Talbot is going to spend most of his life pursuing freedom for himself and his family, and he's going to do it with whatever opportunities are open to him. However it is that he can get away with it, that's how he's going to pursue his freedom. This is one example of that. This is a letter from David Jones. He is Lydia Keith's third husband, who later claims ownership over Toby Talbot. And he's writing here to Nathaniel Packard of Bridgewater, and I've highlighted the relevant parts down here, where he mentions that Toby Talbot is very eager to live in Bridgewater. He's actually trying to live closer to Dinah here. And you'll notice down at the bottom, he ends up saying, if these things can be done without any charge to me, I am content. He has a great mind to clear himself and go free hereafter. And it is now upon that plan that I give leave for his coming to Bridgewater. And at that point, Talbot will begin renting land from Nathaniel Packard. He is bargaining with one of his white neighbors, someone he thinks he can trust as a landlord, and he's asking permission from his enslaver after the fact, after he has established that bargain to go and rent this land. And so ultimately, Talbot and his children, his growing family, move out to that space. They begin to farm the land. We also know that Talbot is going to serve as a laborer for others in the community for pay. And he's going to do several other things that also would have been common markers of citizenship, of full freedom at this time period. In particular, we could go to the next one. In 1775, he's going to enlist for the first time as a soldier in the Revolutionary War on the side of the colonies. Militia service and joining the military is a very common mark of citizenship for free people at this time, and Talbot is doing the same thing. These are only two of his records. He serves multiple tours of duty from 1775 up through about 1780, when he marches with another group of Bridgewater residents up to Westport. He is being paid for this service, so he's able to take that money and use it to help pursue freedom for his family, to establish a place for themselves in the community. But he also uses this service to help foster and build a community of Black veterans in Bridgewater. Because Toby Talbot is not the only Black man serving in Bridgewater in the Army at this point, and he's not even the only maybe enslaved, maybe free Black man doing that. He enlists alongside many other Black men also serving. We can trace his service alongside those men, and many of those younger men go on to intermarry with his children after the war. So they begin to establish this legally conscious, connected community of Black veterans in Bridgewater. We will come back to Toby Talbot in a bit to talk a little bit more about his pursuit of freedom. But before we do that, we need to meet another person that we encounter quite a bit in the Bridgewater records, and that's going to be Cuff Ashford.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to return to Cuff Ashford, whose gravesite we saw in the upper right corner of First Cemetery. We don't know exactly when he was born, probably around 1746. He entered the household of Nathan Mitchell around 1765 at around 19 years old. As Jamie mentioned, the name Cuff is derived from a West African day name from the Akan people. We don't know if Cuff Ashford was in fact born in West Africa or not, but the name Kofi is given to boys who are born on a Friday. It's a day name. Later, after both his father and Ashport's death, Nathan Mitchell's son, so this is the son of the man who enslaved him, would recall Cuff's life with them this way. Quote, that said Cuff was a slave to my father Nathan Mitchell, late of said Bridgewater, deceased, that he came to my father when I was 3 years old and continued there 9 years. So on the one hand, writing in 1936, Nathan Mitchell Jr. calls him a slave explicitly. He's kind of done away with the euphemisms of the previous generations. But on the other hand, he obscures his father's role in Ashport's enslavement, saying he came to my father, as if he sort of just moved in. When an enslaved person, it's very unlikely that he had any choice in the matter. When he was still enslaved to Mitchell, Ashport met and married a local girl, Elizabeth, more often called Lydia Quay. As you can see here, their marriage intention, their marriage announcement. Nathan Mitchell's Negro man, again, that language of possession, and Elizabeth Quay, mulatto girl brought up by Anthony Winslow. And we see this phrase that she was brought up by Anthony Winslow repeatedly. She even uses it herself when she does her widow's pension in 1836, so much later on in her life. We're very sure that Elizabeth Quay, Lydia Ashport, was of indigenous descent. Many indigenous children were taken from their home families and brought up in white families, so that language is consistent, and there's also some genealogical research that Jamie was able to do. And the word Quay was an Algonquin greeting that we were told by an indigenous consultant that we've worked with, and so we're quite sure that she was likely of indigenous descent. She was a young teen when they married at this time, only about 14, 15 years old. Cuff Ashport was around 25. They didn't cohabitate right away. Cuff Ashport was still enslaved until around 1775. So they didn't live together right away. But Nathan Mitchell Jr. quote, remembered that, quote, Cuff's wife was frequently at our house during that time. Cuff and Lydia Ashport would go on to have at least 5 children together. Unlike the Talbots, they did not go to the church and have their children's births announced, but we've been able to put together at least 5 children. There are a couple other Ashports that may or may not be their children, but these we're sure of. And on the left, you can see the 1790 census with Cuff Ashport's name second from the bottom. And there are 7 people in his household at this time in 1790. Their oldest child, Lydia, we're not sure exactly when she was born, but she married in 1802, and they had 4 other children, at least. The 1771 tax valuation that I referred to before, describing Mitchell's land, gives us some sense of Cuff Ashport's life and the labor he may have been doing for the Mitchells. In 1771, when Ashport was enslaved there, Nathan Mitchell owned 72 acres of land, 35 of it pasture for his 12 livestock, including 2 oxen, which would have been used for plowing. He also owned 10 acres of tillage, which likely would have been used for agriculture. Mitchell produced 85 bushels of grain, 8 tons of English hay. But to me, that seems like a lot of hay. I don't farm. I don't know. Does anyone make hay? That just seems like a lot. 5 tons of fresh meadow hay and 15 barrels of cider. There was one dwelling house in 1771 plus a tanning house. 2 dwelling houses and a barn were listed by 1784. So Cuff Ashport was very likely involved in the extensive agricultural work that would have been involved in keeping up this property. He may well have worked in the tanning house as well. In such small-scale New England household farming operations, it was common for enslaved people and the people who owned them to do similar sorts of work. It wasn't like whole separate sorts of work for enslaved people. Like Toby Talbot, Cuff Ashport also served in the military, very much similar times. So we've charted out their courses of service, and they were often serving parallel duties, tours of duty, although not in the same company. They enlisted on the same day, on May 1st in 1775, frequently appeared in similar service lists, and were in Camp Toddaway together after a turn from a 6-month of service in October of 1780. They're right near where Washington was being headquartered in what is today Passaic County, New Jersey. They would have marched all the way from Bridgewater to New Jersey on foot. So they're both serving in the military, serving in the Revolution. In his wife Lydia's widow's pension after Cuff's death, many witnesses gave testimony that tells a story of Ashport's pride in his military service. Jaimie and I work very hard not to sort of tell a story to ourselves about who these men were. We don't want to sort of fill in the gaps with these imaginary ideas of these men's stories. We don't think that's respectful. But in her widow's pension, person after person talks about how Cuff Ashport loved to tell stories about his military service. And so I feel like I can get a little bit of the texture of his personality there, and hear a little bit about what makes him tick. It seems that he really enjoyed telling stories about the war. He said that he was there in Evacuation Day in Boston on March 17th in 1776, and again with Washington as he evacuated New York in the summer of 1776. I don't know if any of you are Revolutionary War buffs, but these are absolute flashpoints in the Revolutionary War. One witness said, quote, "There is no doubt, as he often told of it in his lifetime, that he witnessed the execution of Major John Andre, who would have been colluded with Benedict Arnold, which would have been in 1780. Another mentioned how Ashport described, quote, the face of the country around West Point. Likely he's talking about the beautiful Hudson River Valley in New York. And if you'd show, this is Lydia Ashport's signature at the end of her widow's pension application in 1836. And I've looked through the census records for Bridgewater. Only 5 women in Bridgewater had a Revolutionary War widow's pension at the time. We don't know exactly what Toby Talbot and Cuff Ashport thought about the revolution they fought in with its vaunted calls for freedom from tyranny, but many African Americans at the time and their allies hoped that the revolution would mean the end of slavery in the new nation, as it seemed incompatible with the purported values of the revolution. So if you show the next slide here. So here is the poet Phyllis Wheatley. And so she says in a letter to the Reverend Sampson Occam, who was a Mohegan minister, "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree, I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine." So Wheatley is calling out the hypocrisy of the revolutionary fighters, the white revolutionary fighters, who would say that they are fighting against British tyranny, but who would oppress and enslave other people. And even more directly to the point, this is, if you show the next slide, sorry, this is a petition from Prince Hall, who himself was free, and that's actually the petition in the back, but it's very difficult to read. And there are multiple other signatories, about 6 other signatories, and there were multiple petitions at this time. This one is very direct in appealing to the revolutionaries' own values of freedom from tyranny. The petitioners cannot but express their astonishment that it has never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of their unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of your petitioners, that is, those who are trying to seek freedom from slavery. They therefore humbly beseech your honors to give this petition its due weight and consideration and cause an act of the legislature to be passed, whereby they may be restored to the enjoyments of that which is the natural right of all men, and their children who are born in this land of liberty may not be held as slaves after they arrive at the age of 21 years. So they're asking for emancipation at 21. So may the inhabitants of the state, no longer chargeable with the inconsistency of acting themselves the part which they condemn and oppose in others, be prospered in the present glorious struggle for liberty. One thing I think is really important to point out is that Black people in this country, right away from the very beginning, are pointing out the hypocrisy of the founding principles that doesn't apply to them. And that's just really important to remember whenever anybody says that protest is not patriotic, or that, you know, that we're sort of rewriting history, that right away at the beginning, people who were enslaved said, hey, wait a minute, this liberty and justice for all, this should apply to us. This wasn't like some revisionist thing that came later. There were people right there at the very beginning who saw the hypocrisy and who pointed it out, and who pointed it out in writing, who said to the legislature, this is to the Massachusetts, the brand new Massachusetts legislature, hey, you know, we're all for freedom and justice and liberty for all, but that needs to extend to us as well. And happy to be part of the nation, but wanting the same benefits and freedoms as well. So there was a lot of hope that the revolution was going to end slavery in Massachusetts, but it didn't. It didn't end slavery in Massachusetts, let alone in the United States as a whole. The Massachusetts Constitution, written by John Adams, starts out, all men are born free and equal, but that also did not end slavery in Massachusetts. Jaimie is going to talk about how slavery did end in Massachusetts.
Or the question.
Or the question
of how it
slavery
ended.
in Massachusetts.
I'll say that because it is very much a question as to how emancipation and freedom comes about in Massachusetts. As a legal scholar, the conventional narrative that I received when I first moved to this state was that it was a series of legal cases that did this, that it was the cases known as Brom-and-Bett versus Ashley in 1781. People would often call this the Mumbet case. And then later, Commonwealth versus Jennison, a series of cases known as the Quock-Walker cases that range from about 1781 to 1783. The narrative I had received was that these court cases, with the interpretation that they gave us of the new Massachusetts Constitution, ended slavery in the state. But that is an incomplete narrative, and it's not a fully accurate narrative either. First and foremost, we want to emphasize that slavery did not end immediately in Massachusetts. Instead, this is a state that had what the scholar Joanne Pope-Malish calls a gradual emancipation. Emancipation happens over a series of many years in the state and through multiple means. And it definitely does not end in the state or in Bridgewater all in one fell swoop. But the second thing to emphasize is that something we keep finding in our own research is that enslaved people living in the state were working for decades or more, well prior to Brom-and-Bett v. Ashley or some of those other cases, to free themselves. The scholar Gloria Whiting has recently published a book on slavery in Massachusetts, and one of our findings conforms very much with one of hers that I'll quote. In early New England, as in so many other times and places, the enslaved were the first, the fiercest, and the most effective advocates for their own emancipation. And we see this in our records as well. The people authoring their own freedom are often the enslaved themselves, and they are doing it in the years prior to some of those legal cases that come about in the 1780s. So we want to emphasize that rather than that old narrative of a kind of top-down into slavery that starts with the courts and the Constitution, that actually we can see slavery beginning to end by the efforts of the enslaved on the ground prior to those cases. So we see several patterns in our own research on slavery and freedom in Bridgewater. We know that people freed themselves through diverse means. Some people simply walked away or ran away from the households that enslaved them. Other people began to make bargains. They purchased their freedom. They used strategies such as marriage or church affiliation, or bargains with white neighbors, like we see with Toby Talbot, to kind of get themselves living as free as possible, even if the institution of slavery is still legal all around them. And one of the places that we can see this is kind of in the arena where the chaos of the revolution, the tumult of this period, creates opportunities, often for people to free themselves. This is one example. Everyone here is probably familiar with Torrey House. It is right down the road from us. And probably all of you are familiar with the story of how Colonel Josiah Edson is forced to leave the town, very forcefully, around 1774, 1775, because of his continued ties to the British Crown. But one thing we know is that there's a missing piece here for Torrey House. As you're seeing on our slide, the historical marker for Torrey House has really emphasized the memory of the house in the 19th century, where it's primarily associated with the Underground Railroad. We know, however, that when Josiah Edson lived in this space, it was also the home and the space of labor for a number of enslaved people, all of whom were enslaved to Colonel Josiah Edson. The snippet that you're seeing over on the right is from Josiah Edson's ledger book, which is in the archives at Old Bridgewater Historical Society. And you're seeing, this is actually one of the final pages of that book. He has recorded here the birth dates and one death date of enslaved people who lived in his household. We know that at least 5 people are enslaved to Colonel Josiah Edson in this time period, and there may well have been more. Now, when Josiah Edson is forced out of the house in the 1770s, he leaves town in quite a hurry. And what that did was enable
An enslaved man purchased by him from his enslavers, occupied by his widow, returned to the white family who owned him, passed on to a company that made cotton gins, and then owned by a university where I teach and sometimes talk about the stuff that employs us, all right there. Jaimie, can you talk more about Toby Talbot's?
Sure. And I also first wanted to point out a few of the different sites that we've already talked about on the map. So here we are at the public library. That's our first red circle, but this would be right around the area of the Ashport land over near Boyden Hall on the BSU campus. First Cemetery is just right around the corner from that. And then of course we have Torrey House, not too far from us either. The 1832 Bridgewater map that you're seeing over on the right also marks out the Cuff Ashport land. You can actually see his first name listed there as Cuffy. You can see the little image for the Unitarian Church off to the side, if that's a helpful marker to have. So we are really right around these physical sites where Bridgewater's African American community left their mark. To return to Toby Talbot, and this is very much why he is one of my favorite people to talk about as a legal scholar, Talbot's freedom that he's working to claim in the 1760s is going to run into some problems around the 1770s and 1780s. Talbot is going to have to eventually avail himself of the courts to get his freedom. One thing that we can see is that eventually in 1779, Talbot is going to make his way into the Plymouth County Courts, actually the Plymouth County Court of Common Pleas. This is a civil court where you sue people over debts, things of that nature. Talbot is going to go into the Plymouth County Court of Common Pleas because he is alleging 2 things. One, that his neighbor, Jesse Howard, has been illegally claiming him as an enslaved person when Talbot would like to be recognized as free. But second, that Jesse Howard has actually stolen from him. Howard, according to Talbot, has come onto his land. He's stolen 2 cows, 1 pig, and if I'm getting this correctly, I want to say it was 25 bushels of parsnips. Now, some of the wealthier citizens in Bridgewater at this time would have had only a few cows, maybe a few pigs. So for Talbot to have gotten to the point of renting land, owning a couple of cows and a pig, harvesting all of that produce, he and his family would have worked incredibly hard for this through his own labor, through the farm, and it would have represented a real blow to his wealth to have a neighbor come onto his property and take that away from him. His family needs this to survive. And not only that, but it's an affront to his dignity, because Howard's argument is that he can take that property because he believes Toby Talbot is his property as well. And Talbot is going to go to court to make the argument that absolutely that is not the case. That not only is he a free man, but actually that Jesse Howard owes him money. Jesse Howard needs to pay him back for the property he stole, and Talbot is there to insist on it. And in fact, he's going to win that case. You will see in this, the highlighted portion, we find that Toby Talbot here is a free man. And in fact, the court further rules that Jesse Howard owes Toby Talbot the sum of 139 pounds damage, as well as taxes to account for it because of that livestock as well as that produce that he stole from Toby Talbot. So Talbot now has the very powerful recognition from a local court saying that he is indeed free. But this is not going to be the end of the story. It appears that Talbot's successful victory in court sparks some issues for his neighbors. Not too long after he wins that first victory, he alleges some of those same white neighbors come onto his land and they attack and beat two of his teenage daughters. One is going to be Dinah Talbot, named after his wife Dinah. She'll be about 18 years old at the time. The other is his daughter Matilda, who you're seeing in this legal record. Matilda would have been around 16 years old at the time. Talbot's allegation is that his neighbors came onto his land, beat these two girls, and then took them and held them in slavery, and they are still being held at the time that he is arriving in court. So he is there to sue for their freedom, and he's there to insist that the neighbors return them. And unfortunately in this case, the Plymouth County jury is not going to find in favor of the Talbots. In fact, they end up ruling that the violence against Dinah Talbot is legal because she is enslaved, and they determined that Matilda Talbot has no basis for a lawsuit because she too is enslaved. This gives us an indication of the very mixed status of slavery and how people in the community thought about it at the time. You have a jury that a year earlier is willing to recognize Toby Talbot's freedom. A slightly different jury from the same county, not that much later, is consigning his two daughters to slavery. But beyond that, there is also an indication here of how the law is treating enslaved people at the time still. The jury determines that, for example, the beating of these two girls can't be addressed through the law because they are enslaved. This is showing us that the law is effectively indemnifying violence against them. It is saying that they are legal non-persons who can't sue to protect their own rights and their own bodies. Now, Toby Talbot, as you would expect if you've gotten a good feel from him here, is going to appeal this decision. And in fact, he's going to appeal it to, at the time, the Superior Court of Judicature. This would have been what will become your Supreme Judicial Court. It is the highest court in the state. So Toby very boldly appeals this case and goes before the highest court at the state level to continue to challenge his neighbors over the freedom of his daughters. I'm not entirely sure what type of agreement he reaches with those neighbors, but we do know that at Superior Court, he reaches some sort of settlement with them that allows his two daughters to eventually move into freedom. We do know that shortly after the case and the appeal, they begin living again as free women in Bridgewater society. His elder daughter, Dinah, is going to marry a local man, John Foy, who actually served alongside Toby Talbot in the Revolution as another soldier. They'll marry in 1785, and then about 3 years later, Matilda Talbot will marry Peter Pierce, and they'll go on to live in West Bridgewater, continuing to have children and other descendants who stay for some time in the Bridgewater area. Talbot lives a pretty long life in Bridgewater after this. There's some dispute about his age at death. What you're seeing here is the first parish death record for him. This is from 1815, and you'll see him on the second line there listed as Toba Torbet. You see his race noted on the side, and then it says he's supposedly 94. We're not quite sure about that. Some of his military records indicate that his birth date was around 1735, so he may have been in his 80s. But it was not uncommon for people at this time to actually be unsure of their age, and it certainly wouldn't have been uncommon for someone with Talbot's background who may have been born into slavery to have been deprived of the knowledge of what year he was born. He himself may not have been totally sure what year he was born. We do know, however, that he is buried over in First Cemetery, so that is pretty proximate to us.
All right, so we know we're pretty far from the Civil War, so if you wanted to know what was happening closer, I'll give just a little bit of population analysis between the beginning of the 19th and mid I'm gonna skip that part because I think we're running out of time. So Cuff Ashport also died in his 80s. And if we want to know a little bit about what happens to the Black population of Bridgewater and the Bridgewaters over time, we did. We wanted to know, well, what happened to the Ashports, to the Talbots, and to this community over time. So I did a page-by-page analysis of the census records from 1790 to 1850, looking for people who were marked as people of color. And just to note that Indigenous people, if there's some, I said of people of color because some Indigenous people would be in there even though Indians not taxed were excluded from the census, but there was this whole kind of developing racial category that was called colored that includes some Indigenous people in it. So Lydia Quay is in here, Lydia Quay Ashport, even though we know she's Indigenous. So there are some people who are Indigenous and of mixed Indigenous and Black ancestry in here as well. So what happens to the population over this time? You can see that Bridgewater itself, the population has doubled between 1790, more than doubled between 1790 and 1850, but the Black population, the population of color, has not. There's a little bit of a bump, so slavery ends somewhere in 1780s. By 1790, there are no enslaved people in the census. It doesn't mean that nobody's living in a situation like slavery, but no white person says, I own anybody by then. It's socially unacceptable to say that. And there's at least one historian who has a record of a census taker being told, if somebody says they own somebody, pressure them to say, are you sure you want to say that? Are you sure you want to be so singular? And then they'll be like, oh no, I guess not. So there are some people who are still living in situations like slavery at this time. So we get a little bit of a bump, and then the parishes start to be broken out. So you can see East Parish, North Parish, etc. And then in the 1820s, the towns start to establish themselves as separate towns, and you get, by 1830, separate censuses. So you can see that in the percentages over time, in 1790, there's 2.5% population of people of color, and by 1850, overall in the Bridgewaters, it's 0.77. Very specific families are anchoring these populations, so the Talbots in West Bridgewater, in Bridgewater proper, the Ashports, in North Bridgewater, the Easton family we haven't talked about, but Hosea Easton, the most famous of them. In East Bridgewater, there really isn't an anchoring family, and we're down to 0.18% by 1850. So these are really, really small population numbers. And the next one. And even more sort of discouraging, I find these numbers of people living in their own households that you'd expect after the end of slavery to see that people would start to move into their own households and not be living in white families anymore. But actually, we don't really see that as much as you'd expect. So right after, you start to see people of color headed households jumps up a little bit, but then it's very stable, remarkably so, 17 in 1790, 17 in 1850. So you're really not seeing people able to kind of move into establishing their own place. The percentage of people of color living in white-headed households is 40 in 1790 and 31 in 1850. Hosea Easton, who I mentioned just now, was a Black activist in his own time. He died in 1837, and in that same year, he wrote a treatise, and he wrote, quote, "Slavery in the form and character of prejudice is as fatal, yea, more fatal than pestilence. O prejudice, thou art slavery in disguise." He wrote about how his father, James Easton, had tried to establish a trade school for Black young men in North Bridgewater, and that it was wrecked by the pressures of prejudice and racism in the town. So we might expect that the end of slavery sort of brings on an ability to establish people's own homes and families in the towns, and that didn't happen. And Hosea Easton is one voice we have to kind of explain why. The Ashports' grandchildren are living in multiple different houses. We know some are as far away as Boston in service positions. And 75 years after, I wasn't ready for that. 75 years after Cuff Ashport purchased his freedom, his great-grandson Albert, was living in a different Mitchell's house. So these patterns of not necessarily enslavement still, but these arrangements of people of color, Black people living in white households persist. And of those 21 family names, you see them recurring in the census, still having Black people living in their homes over these generations. So I've done sort of incredibly nerdy census spreadsheet work with this, and you see all but 3 of those family names recurring well up until 1840, the very same families who still have Black people living in their houses. And so these patterns were very persistent as slavery sort of reconfigures itself into a new racial order that still is keeping Black people at the bottom of the social order. That's my point. To end on a different note, we do have one image of a great-grandchild of Cuff and Lydia Ashport, who did serve in the Civil War. So this is Lemuel Ashport, who was born in Bridgewater proper in 1846, but lived most of his life in Brockton. He became the first Black police officer in Brockton, and served in the 54th Colored Infantry and survived. And this is an image of him, so he was their great-grandson. He died, he was born after both Cuff Ashport and Lydia Ashport died. Lydia died in 1842, so he missed overlapping with them, but he is a direct descendant and one of the only people that we have a photograph of, and in fact served in the Civil War. So that is where we will end. We have lots of people to thank, many of whom are in this room. Mary of Old Bridgewater Historical Society, Rebecca, who's been a great, Becky's been a great friend of this work, and Steve, thank you for that amazing find with Cuff Ashport, and we felt very supported by the community in this work, and we're happy to take any questions. We have also a list of some of the books that we referred to, and thank you all for being here, and we're very happy to hear any of your questions and thoughts. Shall we?
Yeah.
How did you determine from the censuses starting in 1790 and ending in 1840 that there were specific individuals in a family's home when there are no specifics given in those censuses?
So I couldn't tell who so some of the each census has a different way of being organized. Yeah. So in 1790, it would just say how many people were in the head of household's home. By 1850, it does have names, so you can see who's living with whom. So it just depends on the specific year. So in 1790, I don't know which person of color is living in which home.
Well, I think by 1830, they actually list how many colored people, Black people, are living in that household.
Oh, yeah, even in 1790 it does.
Okay.
Yep.
So you're looking at those and making an assumption that it's the same people?
Oh, no, I don't know that it's the same people. What I'm saying is that in the white households who enslaved people in 1771 still have people of color living with them by 1840. I'm not saying it's the same person who's still alive 50 years later.
Okay.
Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. But in the case of the Ashport, so Cuff Ashport is enslaved to Nathan Mitchell, gets his freedom in 1775. 75 years later, in 1850, 2 of their descendants are still living in an arrangement in which Albert Ashport, the great-grandchild of Cuff and Lydia Ashport, is still living in a white Mitchell's home. Okay. So I can't speak to exactly what the arrangement there is. Right. Is Albert Ashport working for? I think it's a David Mitchell. I'd have to look in my notes. I don't know exactly what's going on, but you see that pattern over and over again, where the very same families are still, and it just speaks, I think, to how entrenched these social structures and social relations were. Yeah. Thank you.
This is not a question, but the list, you said the list of the children of Toby, you didn't know what order it was in. It was it's alphabetical by first name.
Yeah, it's all
strange.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting choice on their part. Like, no, I think you would go by date. I want to go by date.
All vital records are alphabetical. It's annoying. I've reordered it before, but it looks better like this. Yeah.
I'm curious how we know, as a matter of fact, that Toby's children, we know the visas that were put upon women of color back then, by the people who enslaved them. But we know that they had those children together and that they weren't a product of abuse.
Or should I?
Do we know that?
We don't know, I mean,
I know he claimed them,
Yes.
obviously, but do we know that that is the case?
I think it might be impossible to truly, in the same way that it is impossible to actually know almost anyone's parentage in this time period. It very much seems like these two have set up a household together because of the Nathaniel Packard letter, where it is clear that he is, at one point he says he's moving him and his family here. The initial child that they have together, Sarah, Ephraim Phobes is quite old. Like he's quite near his death.
Oh,
at the
like
time.
maybe not able to adopt
He is
So-
very much older,
But
and
he has sons.
like around the same time that Dinah Gould is marrying Toby Talbot is around the same time that Phobes' will is being read. So
Okay.
that's kind of where he is age-wise relative to her. I would have to look back and see if he had children in his family, other children, but the indication in all of the vital records, particularly their own insistence on registering the children's birth and their insistence on marking things out with a marriage, has always really implied to me, especially since they are later living together, that these are his children that he is looking to claim through that marriage. I have a lot more questions about what the two Talbot daughters may have experienced whenever they were kidnapped
Right.
than I do about the Toby Talbot and Dinah Talbot marriage, in part because he is very insistent on staying close to his family and keeping them together in a way that implies very much that they were always as much one household together as they could have been, which is honestly pretty unusual for the time.
How far have you really tracked the Talbots? I'm actually living in a house owned by Talbot.
Oh, great.
And
That's what we hope for, local secrets coming out, yeah.
his parents have a house that's quite old. I don't know, it's got a date on it, on Crescent Street. And I have photographs of them, and they are, the story from the neighbors is that the couple was black and mash pea. And so, like I say, I think I'm sort of like seeing the last of the Talbots.
They have descendants, the Talbots there are living descendants around the country, and there's one, at least in Canada, who's published a long genealogical treatise that is, that traces from now back, and that's more interested in contemporary descendants. So they're out there. There are still Talbots out there, and there's a cemetery in Taunton.
There is a Talbot family cemetery out near Taunton, and there's also a little bit of a deed dispute in the early 1800s around some of their land, where the land that I believe the Talbots were living on that they were renting from the Packards, they just
Massachusetts.
they stay on that land even though they never purchased it. And there is this dispute later on where Jacob Talbot, one of their children, is still living on the land, and actually some other free black people living nearby come to try to take the land away from him. There's kind of a dispute about whether he's legally supposed to be there or not, or are they gonna kick him off the land? And I've traced them about that far back to try to find out if they ever purchased land in town, but I actually can't find a record of Jacob Talbot ever purchasing that land. I've just got a record of a lot of people trying to make him leave it. But I would love to know more, because there are several different pieces that I have, historical snippets about where they may have been living or where Talbot may have sought shelter some of the time when he was occasionally on the run from the law.
Are you in West Bridgewater or Bridgewater?
Bridgewater.
Oh, right in Bridgewater. Yeah, because they moved to West Bridgewater
then-
fairly early, but yeah.
But then Talbot clearly comes back here because he dies in Bridgewater.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a house on Crescent Street. We have a picture of the couple standing in front of the house. He looks more Indian than she does, but and then their son ends up getting a house right on South Street. And that's in the 20s. I mean, that's the house get.
And we
Bill.
we have some evidence that the Talbots have some Massachusetts ancestry as well. So some of the later Talbot descendants show up on the rolls as Massachusetts.
Yeah, like I say, it's sort of, you know, it's
Yeah.
third and fourth hand. It's like people who were friends with these folks, and
That's great.
Yeah, we'd love to know more about that.
Well, yeah.
Anyone else?
I had a thought.
Yeah.
The way that the courts ruled differently.
Can't hear you.
Talk it up.
Oh, the way that the courts dealt with the cases differently, could that also be some institutional racism where it involved women and how they voted not in favor in that situation? And when it was the male issues, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Right. Talbot goes in the first time as sort of a head of household and as an individual in a way that might be more compelling. It's hard to say, but Dinah and Matilda are very vulnerable subjects of the law. They're women and they're young women.
Yes.
And I have to wonder if that matters, or even if Talbot's own efforts to kind of free himself were recognized by the jury that these two young girls don't have that history, can't have that history yet, can't have been out seeking freedom on their own in the way that he had. And I've wondered if the jury is initially recognizing Talbot's own efforts, but not seeing the same thing for his two daughters.
And we also, you know, suspect there may have been, Jamie mentioned this, but an aspect of retaliation.
Yeah.
You know, Caretha Mitchell, who's one of the scholars that we mentioned, has a theory of what's called know your place aggression. You know, that when marginalized people are looking to establish themselves, to succeed, to make their way even legally, as we talked about here, that there's often retaliatory violence or aggression that comes back their way, and that, you know, taking this out on the daughters may have been that, and that the jury may have also been less, you know, we don't know, we're just speculating, but that this is a pattern that we see in history of people, you know, receiving aggression when they're succeeding, when they're making their way.
Know your place.
Know your place, that's what she calls
Is
it.
the jury mixed, or is it all male?
All white men, would be all white.
All
White
white
men.
landowning men at this
Right.
time. So like only a very small subset of men are eligible for jury service in Bridgewater, and it's not most of them.
Just curious, is this, I mean, this is so incredibly deep and rich work that you've done. Do you have areas of exploration to further pursue relative to Bridgewater, or is this as far as you can go?
Oh no, we're always learning more things. We know more stuff that we couldn't say too. So there are more individuals that we could talk about. Jamie has a lot more about the individuals from Torrey House and a lot that she learned from the ledger from OBHS. So there are more people, there are more families, there are more stories. And I think also I'm quite interested in the question about what is happening in these later decades and how does it interface or intersect with some of the activism that's happening, but it seems to be happening around abolition in the South, when there are people struggling right here.
Yeah.
And people like Hosea Easton who are trying to call attention to that and saying, like, what about us? And he sees no daylight between slavery in the South and oppression, discrimination, racism in the North that he's living through. He doesn't see any difference between it. So, you know, Frederick Douglass comes to New Bedford right then in 1838, and you know, has a number of years there doing his on the abolitionist circuit. What is happening that those movements don't really link up? I don't know that, and I haven't really seen anyone writing about it. But
I think Mr. Wilson is going to be speaking to that, isn't he, Evie?
There's a man from Brockton,
Yeah,
Larry
I know
Wilson.
him, yeah.
Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Okay, he's coming, I forgot.
26th.
The 26th.
26
Yeah.
at the Bridgewater Senior Center. But he has a lot of history from our Brockton area and all of the Bridgewaters. So if you'd like to get in touch with him, I can give you
Thank you. Yeah.
some information, his email address.
I met him at your Underground Railroad event a couple years ago.
Oh, yeah.
He actually taught at BSU years ago.
Oh. my daughter is the senior pastor of the Congregational Church in Walpole, and they're doing a in-depth history, deep dive within their church records. And it turns out that one of their deacons had bequeathed a slave to the church. And this has created a lot of work, concern, and embarrassment on the part of the church members. And so they're in the process now they've hired a historian to really dig in, but he was clearly, it was all the euphemistic language. And he was bequeathed to the church to act as their sexton, but of course there was no money, no money spent on him. But then he ended up marrying a free woman who advocated for him, and she ended up, insisting that he pursue his freedom. But churches were implicated as well as everyone else. Institutions owned slaves.
The church was the town government, basically, in the 18th century.
Yeah.
So it's not. It shouldn't. It doesn't surprise us in that this is.
But it does. It speaks to that whole. I mean, this really. Every town should be looking into this, because there must be town records, to be pursued in every town across the country to see what was going on throughout history, that isn't being told.
The Community Preservation Committee in Bridgewater is purchasing it's a book. Eric Edson goes back to 1735. We got the book. I'm on CPC. We got the book recently. It's right now with the NEDCC to be evaluated. But Eric Edson was the coroner in Bridgewater. And the book itself it's a charter of, it's not the Bay Colony, it's a charter, I can't remember what, but there's so many of Mr. Edson's handwritten notes that the pages, it goes back 300 years, 200 years, I can't add. We're looking to see what can be pulled from those pages to digitize it, but that might be something that once it comes back.
Wow.
Will you be doing another one of these to talk about the other families in the Dory house?
If someone will have us, we'll probably come. We tend to say yes.
Give us a couple of months.
A little bit
of time.
Okay, we are.
Thank you so much.
I just want to apologize because somebody say at the beginning of everything, please turn your phone off. These are my two little former neighbors that have moved over to Hanson, and they were calling to wish me happy birthday.
Oh, yeah. Happy birthday, Gloria.
So, Jamie and Evelyn, thank you so very,
Yes,
very
thank
much
you
for
very
coming
much.
today.